Here we are picking back up with Greece. To start off with, we need to understand a little bit about the terrain because, as I especially like to mention in my classes, if you can ever come to one in person, those are, in my opinion, better. Um, not knocking the online thing, it is what it is. Anyway, uh, agriculture plays a huge role in the development of civilizations, but the way that I explain it, agriculture is not limited to just what you farm. It deals also with the terrain. It deals with climate changes, so on and so forth. So here we can see a map of the Greek peninsula, which is covered with mountains. There were no large rivers, so these natural boundaries created very, very separate communities. This is very different from the ancient world of the Middle East, in which there are few mountains, and so communication between different areas is actually a good deal easier, and also agriculture easier, being in the ancient Middle East. On the Greek peninsula, however, because of the rocky soil, because of the terrain, agriculture is difficult. And eventually, the peninsula depends very much on importing certain foods that were much more difficult to grow. Because the region is so mountainous, as I mentioned earlier, communication is more difficult. But on top of that, this does not encourage a national growth. This encourages individual city-states to take root. When we think about ancient Greece, some people will focus specifically on the Spartans, others on the Athenians, different regions, and it's because of the terrain that we see these individual cultures taking root. Now, the one product, agriculturally speaking, that the Greeks were able to produce and to capitalize on was olives. Olives grew very well in the region and brought great economic growth to the peninsulas. It also encouraged an intermingling of cultures between that of the Greek peninsula and that of the ancient Middle East. So we see evidence of these interactions through languages, through art, through literature, through different things. So it is a fairly important trade that develops. In the earliest Greek societies, we do see the development of heroic beliefs and values, and this is very important to the Greeks because this leads to an idea of supremacy. In Greek heroic society, individuals seek fame by accomplishing great feats, and they advocate values like honor and reputation. Arete or aret, I don't know how to say it. I don't speak Greek, so you can laugh at me behind the computer screen. This is the idea of excellence, bravery, virtue, fulfilling one's purpose effectively. And ultimately, we can kind of point this back of this is the Greek pride, okay? So if you are exhibiting arete, then you very much have the Greek pride. And this pride is indicated even in Greek literature. Homer is seen as the most influential Greek poet. His two most famous epics are the Iliad and the Odyssey. In his writings, Homer defines the highest value for any man, which is arete, and in order to completely display this value, one must compete in sports, in war, or in other recreational activities so that you can show your manliness, so you can show your courage. This competitive spirit leads to feelings of animosity from the Greeks towards others. And the Greeks see other cultures, really any other culture, as being barbaric, simply not as good as the Greeks. Another Greek poet, which sort of helps us to understand a little bit more about some of these Greek cultural and personality characteristics is Hesiod. Hesiod gives insight into everyday life for common Greek people. His was a trying life, though. He did not get his inheritance because of his brother and some corrupt politicians. He saw heroic individualism as worth going after, but he saw this pursuit as having two kinds of strife. The good strife led to individuals working to achieve their best. The bad strife led to corruption and exploitation of others, which Hesiod very much experienced in his lifetime. In thinking about the Greek gods, we see the first Greek historian, Herodotus, claimed that Hesiod and Homer shaped Greek religion. In these men's poems, we are introduced to Greek gods and goddesses who are very much like humans. The chief gods lived on Mount Olympus and consisted of Zeus, Hera, Aphrodite, Athena, Poseidon, Apollo, and Demeter, and eventually we do have other gods added in. Because the gods are so much like humans, they shared human flaws, human likes, human dislikes, human characteristics. Because the gods were seen as enjoying banquets, sports, anything that people would like, music, the theater, we see people beginning to infuse religious worship in these everyday activities. There were priests and priestesses that worked kind of like part-time. Part-time priests here, and they had very little training. The real sort of religious professionals, as it were, are the oracles. An oracle was a person who could supposedly interpret the will of the gods. The most famous oracle was the oracle at Delphi. When the oracles interpreted, they spoke in ambiguous riddles, which required an additional person to interpret the interpretation of what the god has sent in a message. So we do see sort of evidence of these ideas a little bit in other cultures as well. If you remember the Hebrews, we have prophets who are speaking direct divine revelation from Yahweh, from God, to the people. But the difference between the Greeks and the Hebrews is that the Hebrews are they're not speaking in riddles. They are speaking in very plainly. Hey, repent, or you're going to be punished. And we'll see an example of the some of the ridiculous riddles that come from the oracles a little bit later on. The Greeks very much were focused on reason and logic. They believed that they could learn everything about the world and also understand it. And so they started to search out scientific understandings for the world and how the world worked. And this thirst for knowledge they called philosophy, or the love of wisdom. And this was probably the most important impact on intellectual advancement coming from the ancient Greeks. So some of these ancient philosophers, let's talk about them. We have Thales of Miletus, who is the earliest known philosopher. And it appears that he studied Egyptian as well as Babylonian astronomy and geometry. He used this learning in practical ways, such as by measuring the pyramids and predicting a solar eclipse. Thales believed that everything in the universe was orderly and that humans would be able to understand how the world works. He thought, for example, that water was the one element keeping everything in the cosmos in order. So through his study, he believed that he could figure out how everything worked, and in his mind it was water. Water was keeping everything together. Another philosopher is Democritus, who is the first to think that the universe was made up of tiny atoms with spaces between them. And it's not until the early 20th century that people believed this particular idea and supported it. Pythagoras, you've probably definitely heard of Pythagoras with the Pythagorean theorem, right? He was a great mathematician and astronomer. He thought the universe, different from Thales, he thought the universe was based on numbers, not on water. So leave it to a mathematician, right? You know, Thales, you're an idiot. It's numbers. So he believed that math held the key to understanding the universe. He was also the first to suggest that the Earth and other heavenly bodies were round and rotated on their axes. So if you were taught that Columbus believed the Earth was flat, no, you were lied to. So here we are in ancient Greece, and we have someone who says, hey, the planets are round. They're rotating on axes. While we see these thinkers as providing the world with great advancement in thought, there were many people living then that felt these men were ignoring or even like thumbing their noses at the gods for possibly thinking that something other than the gods held everything together. Even though religion was in many ways kind of like one big party, the Greeks feared impiety. They feared angering the gods. Impiety being acting sort of blasphemous towards the gods, or acting in such a way as if there were no gods, and really not caring about one's actions. Sorry, got something crazy on the computer. There we go. Oh, Athens. Okay, so so for example, with this fear of impiety, we see Greeks warning people not to tempt the gods into anger, because remember, the gods are very much like people. They're jealous and they will act out in anger. They're not necessarily overly wise, and they're not necessarily rational. So we have to be careful that we don't anger them. And this became such a concern that we see even in Athens in 432 BC, that it became a crime to teach something other than religious thought when explaining the universe. So that kind of gives us a brief introduction to the world of the Greeks. So now let's talk about the people themselves and go through sort of a chronology of what's taking place with this civilization. The earliest known people grouping on the peninsula, earliest known civilization on the peninsula was the Minoans, and I apologize for the rocking back and forth. My fingers start to hurt after a while. There we go. The Minoans, who were named for King Minos, they were located across southern Greece. A large portion of Minoan people were located on the island of Crete. At its height, Crete, let's see if I can, here we go. So if you're looking at your map, it's sort of right down here at the bottom. So here's the Greek peninsula right here, the island of Crete. And you come over here and you can see this is the Italian peninsula. So when we talk about the Romans, we're moving over this way. And then this is the bottom portion of Europe and northern Africa. So here we are. We're talking about this area right here. And we have the island of Crete down towards the bottom. So the Minoans are largely located on the island of Crete. At its height, Crete boasted somewhere around about 250,000 people living in relative peace. Historians tend to think that these people were probably Semitic, meaning they more than likely were related to some peoples in the eastern and southern Mediterranean region. Possibly because of some relation, the Minoan people traded with those of the Fertile Crescent and other Middle Eastern peoples. The Minoans, as with all seafaring civilizations, were influenced by the people they interacted with, as we mentioned earlier. The Minoans learned to make bronze, as well as how to develop a written language from the Sumerians. Their art reflected Egyptian artistic styles. Now, historians are not exactly sure how the Minoan society actually ended, but archaeological evidence points to invaders burning the major city. But whatever the cause, the Minoans suffered collapse, and the earliest Greeks, called the Mycenaeans, took control of the Aegean region, which is this this region through here with the Aegean Sea. While the Minoans still lived, the Mycenaeans traded with them. The Mycenaeans, named for their main city, Mycenae, became very prosperous through trade. After the Minoan destruction, the Mycenaeans became the commercial leaders of the Aegean region. Their governing system became more complex, and it appears that they were much more warlike than the peaceful Minoans. And the historians tend to believe that it was the Mycenaeans who invaded the famous city of Troy. Greek myths claim that a Trojan prince seduced a beautiful Greek woman by the name of Helen. The Greeks then invaded Troy to get her back. More than likely, the war resulted from economic tensions. By the end of the war, Troy was destroyed. And it is interesting to note that this particular story, you've got the beautiful woman named Helen. The Greek peninsula was referred to as Hellas. And so when we talk about the Hellenistic age in just a little while, pardon my phone ringing, let me turn that down. During the Hellenistic age, this is the Greek-like age, right? Greek-like. So if anything that is Hellenistic, if we talk about Hellas or anything like that, is think of Greece, right? Greek-like. Now, sometime after 1200 BC, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed. There was a drought, which caused crop failures, internal instability, and Greek invaders from the north also came in. And all of this caused their population to decrease dramatically, and all of the great Mycenaean centers, except for the city of Athens, and that's important to know, were gone. After the fall of Mycenae, the art of writing ultimately was lost. For about 300 years, there are no written documents to give us insight to Greek culture or life. And this is why historians called this particular period of time the Dark Ages. We know through archaeology that iron soon became the metal of choice for weapons and tools. And we also know around the end of the Dark Ages, trade began again throughout the Mediterranean region. As time passed, the Greeks began establishing colonies throughout the peninsula and the nearby islands. Greek colonies were completely independent of their mother city, so whichever city had people leave and they established a colony, they were independent of the city that sent them out. So this is not the same as the British colonies in northern North America, where they were tied to Great Britain politically, financially. No, the ties to the mother city were really only emotional, not very political. As these colonies traded with other cultures, they started sharing ideas and technology, further pushing them out of this time period of the Dark Ages. They learned a system of weight from the Babylonians. They learned writing from the Phoenicians and coinage from the Lydians. With these inventions and others, the Greeks began to move very decidedly forward. And again, the Greeks were always a proud people. This is just a fun quote here from Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher. He said, "Whatever the Greeks have acquired from foreigners, they have in the end turned into something finer." So we see this in this revival of skills, the idea that whatever the Greeks get their hands on, they master it and then they make it better. So we're going to stop here for right now, and we will pick up next time with talking about individual city-states and Greek politics.